Story 1. The Doll in the Attic. When Sarah inherited her grandmother's old house, she decided to turn it into a cozy home for herself. After a few months of renovations, she was finally ready to move in. But one rainy afternoon, while exploring the attic for the first time, she stumbled upon an old, dust-covered doll. The doll was unsettling. Its porcelain face was cracked with one glass eye slightly askew, and its dress was torn and stained with age. Despite her unease, Sarah felt a strange compulsion to bring it downstairs and display it on the living room shelf. That night, strange things began happening. She heard soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway even though she was alone. She brushed it off, thinking it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the noises grew louder each night, and soon, she could hear faint whispers echoing through the house. It sounded like a child's voice calling her name. One evening, she returned home to find the doll in a different position than she'd left it. She thought she'd been careless and hadn't noticed. But over the next few days, the doll kept moving, appearing in different rooms without explanation. The doll's face seemed to change, its cracked mouth twisting into a sinister smile. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Sarah set up a camera in the living room, pointed directly at the doll. The next morning, she checked the footage. Her blood ran cold as she watched the doll shift and move on its own, its glass eyes glowing faintly in the dark. But what terrified her most was the last frame the doll turned to face the camera. Its mouth opened in a wide grin, as if it knew it was being watched. Sarah fled the house that day and never returned. To this day, neighbors claim they can hear a faint child's voice coming from the empty house, calling her name, waiting for her to return. Story 2. The Doll Maker's Curse. Marcus was an antique collector, and his prized possessions were a collection of old dolls from around the world. One day, he stumbled upon a doll at an estate sale that caught his eye. It was a beautiful but peculiar doll with intricately painted eyes that seemed almost lifelike. The previous owner had warned him that the doll had a dark history, but Marcus brushed it off as a way to increase the price. That night, Marcus placed the doll in his collection room and admired it before heading to bed. Around midnight, he awoke to the sound of soft giggling coming from the room. He froze, convincing himself it was just a creaky floorboard or an animal outside. But the laughter continued, louder this time, as though a child were playing just down the hall. He got out of bed and tiptoed to the collection room. The doll was no longer in its spot. Instead, it sat on its desk facing him. Its painted eyes seemed to sparkle with life, and the faintest trace of a smile crossed its face. He placed the doll back on its shelf, thinking he must have somehow moved it and forgotten. But each night, the doll would appear in a different part of the house. Marcus grew increasingly disturbed until one night, he awoke to find the doll sitting on his chest, its cold porcelain hands pressed against his throat. The following day, Marcus took the doll to a psychic. She took one look at it and gasped. This doll carries the spirit of its maker, a doll maker who died with a curse on her lips. She placed her spirit in her creations, determined to live on forever. Desperate, Marcus tried to burn the doll, but the flames would not consume it. Realizing he was cursed, he locked the doll away in a steel box, buried it in his backyard, and moved away. But sometimes when he wakes in the middle of the night, he still hears that faint, chilling giggle, as if the doll is calling for him from beneath the ground. Story 3. The Collector's Dollhouse. Emma loved dollhouses, and as a birthday gift, her mother found her a vintage, handcrafted dollhouse from a local antique store. The dollhouse was detailed to perfection, complete with tiny dolls in each room. Emma was thrilled, spending hours each day arranging the furniture and dolls. One evening, while playing, she noticed something odd. The dolls in the house seemed to have shifted positions from the previous day, as if they'd moved on their own. She laughed it off as her memory playing tricks on her, but the changes continued daily. One day, a doll was lying on the dollhouse floor, its arms twisted behind its back as though it had fallen. The next day, another doll was missing entirely, only to reappear the following morning in a different room, staring out a window as if it wanted to escape. Emma's curiosity turned to fear when she noticed the doll's eyes following her every movement. They seemed almost alive, filled with malice. One night, she awoke to a scratching noise coming from the dollhouse. She turned on her flashlight, and to her horror, she saw the dolls inside moving, turning their heads and shifting their limbs as if trying to escape their miniature prison. She screamed, waking her mother, who ran to her room. But by the time her mother arrived, the dolls were back in their original positions, lifeless and still. Emma refused to play with the dollhouse again, and her mother eventually threw it away. But sometimes, in the dead of night, Emma swears she can still hear faint scratching sounds, as though the dolls are trying to find their way back. Story 4, The Haunted Marionette. Olivia worked at a small theater, where she managed props and costumes. One evening, while cleaning the storage room, she discovered an old marionette puppet hanging from the wall by a single string. Puppet's face was eerily expressive, painted with wide, staring eyes and a frozen smile that made her uneasy. She didn't think much of it at first, but after that night, strange things started happening in the theater. Props would be misplaced, strange whispers echoed in the empty halls, and she often felt as though she were being watched. One evening, as she was locking up, she noticed the marionette hanging from a different string, its body twisted at an odd angle, its eyes seemingly fixed on her. She tried to shake off the chill creeping up her spine, but as she turned to leave, she heard a faint whisper. "Come play with me." She froze, too terrified to look back. But the whisper grew louder, almost playful, as though the puppet were taunting her. She mustered the courage to turn around, and to her horror, the marionette's head had turned to face her, its painted smile wider than before. That night, Olivia quit her job. She never returned to the theater. But local legend says that those who enter the storage room can still hear the marionette, whispering, waiting for someone new to play with. Story 5, The Ventriloquist Doll. In a small town, there was a ventriloquist named Greg who was known for his lifelike doll, Max. People would say that Max had a personality of his own, and some even claimed to have seen him move without Greg's hand. Greg loved his act, but the more popular he got, the more the dolls seemed to turn against him. One evening, Greg left the doll in his dressing room after a show, but as he turned to leave, he heard a faint voice that sounded eerily like Max's, whispering, "You don't control me anymore." He laughed, but as he looked back, he saw Max sitting on the edge of the chair, his head turned toward him, eyes glinting with malice. Terrified, Greg tried to leave, but he found the door locked. As he pounded on it, the doll's voice grew louder, mocking him until he was nearly mad with fear. He was finally freed by a custodian who heard his cries, but when they looked back, Max was exactly where he had been left, lifeless and still. Greg left town, abandoning his career, but rumors persist of a strange doll left behind that talks when no one's around.